Hi, Jim Rondo here from the Canadian Company of Pilgrims Victoria chapter. We're here with Evan and Joyce to talk about the Chemin d'Arles. It's a walk in France. Hopefully you enjoy their talk and their pictures, and there'll be a question and answer session at the end. Thank you very much. Enjoy. So, welcome both of you, Evan and Joy. Please tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you came to know about the Camino and want to walk the Camino.
We have walked several Caminos before, and the Arles Camino is one of the historic Caminos in France. And we were told by people that it could be quite interesting, and it's not very frequented. So that's what started us going.
We flip coins. I follow him. Which one will we do next? That was it.
And probably not unlike a number of other couples, we have totally different experiences of the Caminos. And so sometimes we wonder if we're actually talking about the same Camino that we've walked together. But the Arles Camino, so there are 4 historic Caminos, meaning that they date back to the Middle Ages in France. And 3 of those Caminos join very close to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and a lot of people are familiar with that town, and then they continue on into Spain. But this one is probably the least well known, and it is a southern route, and it doesn't cross the Pyrenees in the same place. It passes it in a place called the Col de Saint-Paul, which is a very, very high pass in the Pyrenees. Anyway, it starts in Arles, which is a very, very beautiful town, well known by a lot of people because Van Gogh did a lot of painting in Arles. And there are Roman ruins. There's a Roman Colosseum in Arles. And from Arles, and then you come to Montpellier, which is a very large city, very beautiful city. And then from Montpellier, you go into a very mountainous region. It's called the Haut-Languedoc, which is the high Languedoc area. And you spend about 10 days, we spent about 10 days walking in those mountains. Then you come down into a plain area and you continue on past the Canal du Midi, which is a very large canal in southern France, to Toulouse, which is the second large city, very big city. And then from Toulouse, you continue on and eventually you get to the foothills of the Pyrenees. And it's about a 5-day walk through the Pyrenees. And that's a very spectacular area. It's quite steep in spots. It's not unmanageable, but it's uphill. And then you drop down into Spain to a place called the Via Aragonese. And it's a very quiet walk. And then eventually that trail in Spain joins the Via Frances. And it joins it almost at Puente la Reina. It actually joins at a place called Obanos, which is just before then. And so the trail is about 970 kilometers in length, and probably 80% of it is in France.
It's 970 kilometers, and it sounds a little bit rugged and a lot of undulating terrain. Is it hard terrain to walk?
Yes, let me speak to that because we had different experiences about that. We've lived in France before, and we had lived in Provence, and so we had been to Arles a number of times, to Montpellier, to was it Saint-Guillaume
Le Désert?
Yeah. So we saw lots of these little hints that the trail was there. So the seed had been planted at that point. And so we've done 6 Caminos, half or all of. And Evan's done some additional ones. And boy, I personally found it the hardest that we had done.
Is it the elevation or the distance you have to go between the towns?
Oh, it's a good question. For me, it was a mixture of the two. I found it was quite rugged in parts. I would say it's more rugged than the hike from Le Puy to Saint-Jean. I also, I miss social. So I really loved the end of the day, sharing a beer, wine with people at a table. That doesn't happen.
You're by yourself, basically?
It's very small. Not a lot of people are walking. We'll go into this in more detail when we talk about the places we stayed. But so I found it lonelier and harder. Evan loved it. So there you go. The couple difference.
When you're walking, are you walking on trails, backcountry roads? What are you walking on?
Yeah, it's a well-marked trail, as the trails are in France. And they have the red and white marker. And like any trail, occasionally if you're not paying attention, you can get off the trail and make a mistake. But essentially, it's pretty straightforward. And we had guidebooks, the guide for hostels, which is called Miam Miam Dodo.
Mhm.
And so we didn't have a problem following it. But it is fairly rugged after Montpellier. The first couple of days are quite flat, quite
Yeah,
doable.
not too long.
And then after the 9 days in the mountains, you get into a plain, which is very pretty. It's very agricultural. The towns are really quite gorgeous. And then you go into Toulouse. But there are patches of it which are, I would say, after Toulouse, some of it is a little bit monotonous. And then, as I said, there's probably a good 5-day walk up through the mountains, always doable, but you're going uphill.
Okay. And you're talking about how far between stops, and is there more important for me, is there coffee stops or wine stops along the way?
Yeah, I'll let Joy talk about that.
Yeah, no.
So what we found, of course, I disagree somewhat, but what we found is that when we walked into the mountainous areas, the towns were largely depressed. These were towns that had been mining towns, or they had small manufacturing, and people have left. So, there wasn't the opportunity to sort of have a 10 o'clock coffee and a croissant and sit back and relax. Basically, you're walking through woods and very, very rural areas. And so there was always a town at the end of the day.
Mhm.
And I would say that our walks were probably around 20 kilometers a day, something like that. But when we went into some of the towns, they were quite depressed. There were only old people. Occasionally, there was nothing open, but there was always a place to stay. And we can talk about the places to stay later. So that part definitely was a bit depressing at times.
Mhm. It really made me aware, sadly, of how, I don't want to say interior France, I'm not sure what to call it, the smaller villages, they are in trouble. So, we use the 2016 guidebooks from the Confraternity of St. James, along with Miam Miam Dodo. And and it wasn't every village, but they would say, active village, 3 bakeries, et cetera, and we'd go in and there would be nothing. And not even bus. We ran into this lovely elderly woman who, she had to rely on her neighbors or friends to take her shopping to the next town because the bus didn't even stop in the village. So they're struggling.
Yeah.
And that was 2019. So goodness knows what it's like now. We've thought about them a lot.
And we had a number of people saying, why aren't more people taking this trail? They kept asking us to fill out surveys. And so we did. But I don't want to give the impression, what Joy has said is definitely the case. But there are certainly parts of the trail that are not depressed like that. Just to give you an example, we went through a town after Toulouse called Marcillac. And it's an absolutely beautiful, gorgeous little town of a population of about 1,300 people. I had no idea, but every year for 3 weeks in July, they have a jazz festival there. And they have 200,000 people come to this jazz festival. And the people that go there is Desi Gillespie, Wynton Marsalis, Diana Krall, et cetera, Joan Baez. I was absolutely astounded. And we got there just after it was over. And of course, they like to party full time, and they had a bull arena, and they had the jazz festival there and throughout the town. And some of these places were really very, very attractive and very interesting. And others, of course, especially in the mountains, were quite depressed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, so you used the guidebook and you used apps. Can you tell us about what accommodation you stayed in, what accommodations are available, and how you actually booked your accommodation?
Yeah, maybe I can start off with that and then pass it on to Joy. I was thinking that basically we had 4 types of accommodation. And the most common were accommodations, even in these very sort of small, almost ghost towns, that were run by the municipality. So often we would get a key and we would be there by ourselves or with 3 or 4 other hikers, and we'd have the run of the place. And there would be a kitchen and so forth, and we can make our own meals. So there were a lot of these municipally run places that didn't have anybody on site. Then the second group with accommodations were run by associations, like the confraternity. So you would have an hospitalière, it would cost a little bit more perhaps, but you would get a communal meal. And some of those places were really great. And then another place we stayed at a few religious communities. We stayed in a convent, in a monastery. We were put up by some lay brothers, and we found those places really absolutely fascinating.
Wonderful.
And then the fourth, where we had occasionally, it would actually be private. So it might be kind of a bed and breakfast with a meal included. We never had trouble finding accommodation, but there was always a mixture of those four.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we were trying to remember prices. I think they averaged about 15 euros a night, say. We did do some donativo, where it was by donation. The lay brothers that we stayed with in that one monastery were that. This was my favorite part of the whole walk, I must say, because we stayed in some very different places from previous Caminos that we've done. For example, one little place we stayed in was they had converted horse stables into little cells, sort of, so we had two single beds. We had one of the horse stables. And several times we stayed in schools because the towns were just so depleted that the schools had shut down. So the municipality would fix up one of the schoolrooms with bunk beds. And I think it's one of the pictures that we sent where they have all the tiny, the short little sinks that you had to use because it was an elementary school that you were in. So I'm trying to think of other.
One occasion was we had a cell phone. We bought a cheap cell phone.
Oh, yeah.
And what we did was we usually phoned either the night before, maybe in the morning. And we some of these places were very small, but there was always a combination available. And as a matter of fact, they kept saying, well, why aren't there more people? But on one occasion, I phoned this, I think it was the municipal hall. They said, oh, well, it's Saturday, we're closed, but we'll give you the mayor's number. So I phoned the mayor up and he was mowing the lawn. And he said, okay, all right. Well, when you come into town, give me a call and I'll meet you at the bar. And he met me at the bar and then he walked me down the street and gave me the key to the accommodation. So it was very relaxed that way. And of course, it was an opportunity to meet people.
Mm-hmm. This is definitely one Camino where you need a phone and you would need some French, even if it was basic, because you have to phone ahead to either get the key to the door or the code or something, and you get it from the Marie or from the Office de Tourisme or the store next door. But you have to make sure they know you're coming, because if you come on a Saturday, everything, the officials are closed and you can't get hold of anyone. So yeah, so that was something that was different. And we usually buy a phone when we arrive in France and buy a SIM card, never at the airport because they're more expensive, and then use that, and it works great. And I'm really spoiled because Evan speaks French, has lived in France and speaks French fluently, so I can rely on him.
Do you need to be able to speak French to walk the trail?
Well, what everybody's experience is a little bit different, of course. But what we have found now that in modern day France, most people speak, a fair amount of French, a fair amount of English. In most sort of larger places, and people under 30 are going to speak English, but because this is a more rural area and it's not sort of vibrant at all, and a lot of the people that we encountered were elderly people, we found that they didn't speak English. So certainly on parts of this route, you really need to have some French to get by. Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, you can get Google Translate and you can use your high school French, but you would need some French. We had a friend from home visiting with us, and she admitted, she said, yes, I really need to use some of my French to make myself known.
Yeah. And the other thing that's quite different with this route is, I mean, we disagreed about this when we were sort of doing our remember whens, but there are a lot of places that do not have a hospitalier there. You're getting a key, you're getting a code, and you have this tiny little space with 2 bunk beds and, basic kitchen. So that I missed too. So you don't have someone to get sort of the lay of the land for the next day. If you didn't speak French, often I know in other Caminos, people would have the hospitalier phone and book ahead. That's not an option here. So just something else that added to the.
When you got into Spain, was it easy for you to switch from French into Spanish?
Let me think about that. I'm not really sure. Joy broke off her trail for a while for various reasons. She was walking in other places, but I walked with a fellow from Trois-Rivières for 2 weeks, and he couldn't speak any Spanish, and I can't speak very much Spanish, but we managed to get by okay. But even on the Spanish side, we found that the trail, there were very, very few people in the trail. We really liked the Spanish side. And as soon as we got into Spain, it felt like the Via Frances. You know, you have these long plains, a golden color, maybe wheat or stubble, earth, and that kind of thing. But there was just nobody on the trail. But we always found at the end of the day, we would have 3 or 4 other co-hikers. So I can't remember a time when we were always alone, but so there was always someone, but not very many. And in Spain, I think I would have to say for the most part, you need to have a little bit of Spanish for sure. You know, even just the basics.
I was going over some of my notes, and in my notes, like we went for weeks without seeing other people on the trail during the day. So I thought, as a woman traveling alone, I probably would have lasted 3 days. Like it just wouldn't, you know, it's just my own style of hiking. I'm perfectly comfortable hiking. I do solo stuff all the time, but there's something about not seeing anyone for 6 to 8 hours when you're in the middle of a forest, and it wouldn't have been as fun.
And that's why I liked it.
I know, that's what it means. We had very different.
But we had a friend who wanted to go walking, and we had tentatively suggested this hike. And then after we were doing it for a while, we cabled her, or we phoned her and said, you know, you should probably just go to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, because she's very, very sociable. She met a whole lot of people in the trail. And that was one of the major draws for it, is this, you know, conviviality and so forth. And ours was different. Yeah. But I will say that when the Spanish trail that I was on hit the French trail, the Via Frances, I walked backwards. In other words, I walked up the trail to Pamplona, and I could not believe the difference. So going from a solitary, quiet existence and hearing the birds ring, and to say, buen camino, every 3 minutes with hundreds of people going the other way, it was a bit of a shock.
So this one is not the parade.
Yeah. You see people in the evening, but it is definitely not a parade.
Yeah. Okay. I tried to track down some numbers to find out how many what is it, 200,000 for the Camino Frances, say? So, but I could not find any numbers. One woman suggested, because there's a great Facebook site for it, if anybody's interested. I would highly recommend it. And one of the moderators has done this hike many times. And she guessed it was about 1/10 of Camino Frances. So maybe 10,000 people in a year do it, or 15,000, that kind of thing, she thought. But I don't know where in the heck they were, because we sure didn't see any. So, yeah.
Yeah. Each Camino is its own thing. And each Camino does have its own rewards and challenges. So other than the isolation, what other challenges did you face?
Oh.
Well, I was surprised. Again, it was more mountainous than I expected. So 2 or 3 days outside of Montpellier, we were definitely in mountains. Again, not impossible by any means, but this was a little bit of a shock to the system. So that would be a disadvantage. And I think even though it's a historical trail, there are not as many vestiges or reminders of the Camino. So there are a couple of places in Arles. This is definitely a starting place, and you start in a really interesting place. It's called the Arles Camp, which is the word for the Elysian fields, where people started walking, and you can visit this beautiful old church, Saint Trophine, and so forth. And when you go to Toulouse, I think it's the largest Romanesque church in France, and it's a Camino route. And there's a statue of Saint-Jacques, and of Santiago, and so forth. But between the major routes, there aren't a lot of historic reminders of the trail. And so I found that a little bit surprising.
As you said, every Camino has its own flavor, because then we left the Arles Camino, and we went and walked several hundred kilometers on the Vézelay route. And there's good people on all those trails everywhere you go. I have such appreciation for our experience, and boy, the food is good in France, the wine is good in France. That is such an attraction to keep going back to that
That's an
country.
attraction, yeah. Guilt-free food.
We've been looking for bad food and wine in France. We have to keep going back to look for it, searching high and low.
It's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it.
So other than the food, tell us about the high points or the rewarding moments that you encountered.
What I will say about that route is, and maybe that's the same for all the Camino routes we've done, but there's such a variety of terrain. Because we had lived in just outside of Aix-en-Provence, I love the Provence area. So, the Camargue is stunningly beautiful. And some of the monasteries we stayed in were beautiful. And it's just...
I just walking into some of these smaller towns, and most people would have this experience, it's charming. So there is a part, I didn't know this at the time, but the Canal du Midi was actually built in the it was built in the 1700s, in 1646 or something like that. And in order to build it, they had to build a second canal called the Rigolet, which is actually a winding stream with woods all around it. And it's an absolutely beautiful walk. It's flat, but it's a winding and so forth. And it joins the Canal du Midi. And you hit it at a point where where the waters from the Atlantic Ocean, the water rushes into the Atlantic, and on the other side, it feeds into the Mediterranean. So to walk along that canal and to have the 3 or 4 days prior to that canal and visiting some of these very attractive towns was really a highlight.
And you walk it when you're heading into Montpellier, right? It leads into, is that right?
Toulouse,
pardon me, Toulouse. Yeah, so.
And also the other part I would say is that because you're walking into the Pyrenees, the towns start to become almost alpine-like. The architecture changes, the type of stone in the house changes. The weather, the air gets a bit crisper, it's cooler in the mornings. And so you really get a sense of walking in the mountains. And that's very, very pretty, that part. And then the Spanish side is fine too. There was an area where they had dammed a huge lake and they had left a sort of town completely uninhabited, and they'd set up a hostel in the ruins of that town. And it was just sort of fascinating to see it and how they had they were still using some agricultural practices that were kind of out of date. And there were kind of people just getting on with their lives in a very quiet sort of way.
Great variety of terrain and land is good.
And, we met good people. We met a number of, not only, but most of the people walking the trail were French. We met a number of French Canadians. And so we met on 3 different occasions, French Canadian guys walking by themselves. And then there were a few Germans on the trail as well. There was a smattering of other people, but I think we were the only Anglophones along with our friend.
Yeah. And we had one point where we ran into a couple and they were going the opposite direction because they were going down to Rome.
Yeah.
I forget what is the one called when it goes from like Canterbury down to Rome.
Well, it goes from, I think it's the Trajan Way, and it goes through Arles and into Italy and then down to Rome.
Right. Yeah.
That's one of ones that we might do in the future. And can you tell us a little bit about the big cities that you passed, and did you spend some extra time in the big cities?
I'll start and then maybe Joy can finish off. Montpellier is a very, very attractive city. It's a very fast growing city. And we sent a picture, and it sort of looks fairly interesting, perhaps. It's a picture of a building, but if you look at the building carefully, the building is all painted. It's trompe-l'oeil. So the windows, the people, the balcony are not real. They're just painted on the side of the building. And there's a huge square in Montpellier, and it's a city of a long tradition of university and medicine and so on. So it's an interesting place to be. But we found that, again, with the big cities, of course, is the challenge either getting in or getting out. So out of Toulouse, we took a day train to get out of Toulouse about 8 kilometers to avoid the suburbs. But Toulouse is also a pretty city. They call it the city of the Rose City. Very interesting architecture, quite wealthy, because Airbus is built around there. And the Saint-Sernin, which is the cathedral, is very much worth seeing. It's an amazing thing. And it was this huge Romanesque church, which is very rare.
Yeah. And Arles is lovely too. We stayed in the Arles hostel and our room looked right onto the forum. It's just, I mean, I'm quite partial to Arles. We went there a lot. It was quite close to where we were living. So, you know what? It's always so much fun though, when you get into those big cities, even though there's always that moment of shock because you're used to much quieter situations, but suddenly, I don't know, you get your own bathroom and you can, you know, buy a new pair of socks and whatever you need to do. So, and the history, those three cities, Arles, Toulouse, and Montpellier in particular, I think are so worth staying an extra day if you can on your trip.
Yeah, it's a great way to start. Arles is a lovely, lovely town.
Yeah.
Excellent. And how did you get there?
We flew to Paris, I think, this time. But the friend that we met up with, who joined us for a couple of weeks, she had flown from Vancouver to Marseille. There's a air transit flight, apparently. I don't know if it, you know, how it's going to go now, but we have friends in Paris that were always, or in France that were always visiting, so we did the scenic route.
But we flew to Paris and then took a train. But we found that those speed trains are really quite expensive. So if it's possible, and I think Air Transat has either gotten bankrupt or been bought by Air Canada now, but if they fly into Marseille, that's the best route to go. Go in there and then maybe take a bus to start before you start the trail.
Yeah. Okay. And the other thing is total deviation, but I tried to talk Evan into us taking, I think it's an Air Canada flight, but you can do a 24 or 48-hour stopover in Iceland. But I couldn't convince him, so I'm still working on him about that.
It has nothing to do with the Camino.
There you are.
You're on the way. You might as well, you know, fit another country in when you're going.
If you were going to give a 50-word reason why someone would do the Chemin Arles, what would that be?
It's a peaceful, physically challenging, beautiful route. So, you know, if you have that, as long as you didn't want a lot of community, I don't know, that's kind of destroying the positives, but
that's basically what I would say. It's a solitary walk, and some of the walks, other walks we've taken have been solitary. So you're looking for something different, perhaps, and it's different, and not that many people take it. So you're taking the trail less traveled, sort of thing. Yeah. So I think that's an advantage. And we found that the people were very receptive because there aren't that many people walking it. We had one woman who prepared meals, and we would go over there and then we would have a tray and then we'd take them back to where we were. And then people were very warm, and the hospitaliers that were working in some of these places were great. So the advantage of not having as many walkers is that you might have a little bit closer contact, personal contact, but it's a solitary walk.
And I know you're both authors and written about this and other books. Can you tell us a little bit about your books, and did they have anything to do with your walks?
Yeah, Evan was a counselor for youth at risk. So when we first hiked the Camino Frances, like from Le Puy to Saint-Jean and then Saint-Jean to Santiago in 2011, I think at one point he said, boy, if I could have taken some of the kids I worked with on this trail, I would have made a difference. So I stole that idea shamelessly and wrote a young adult novel about a young girl who's who does a break and enter and ends up being sent on the Camino as her punishment. So it's got lots of humor, and it's basically a ripoff of our trip.
Oh, that's fair.
It's called Camino Maggie.
There you are.
Plug it too.
Oh, we'll let you plug that.
And so mine was, I had walked a little bit of the Camino at one point, and then I came back all enthused. I said, we've got to do this. We got to do the whole thing. And unfortunately, she said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. So she called my bluff. And then I thought, oh, God, I'm going to have to do this thing. And so I was sort of somewhat resistant to doing it and having all sorts of reservations. And I became a begrudging pilgrim. And I ended up really enjoying it. And partly it was because of the very wonderful people we met and the new experiences that opened us up to some self-discovery. Mm-hmm. So it's about walking from Le Puy to Santiago, and then of course on to Finisterre. So it was a 2.5-month trip that we took, and it was a very rewarding experience.
And Evans is nonfiction, so it's our actual trip.
I always find it's interesting when I walk with my spouse, we seem to walk on different routes too. So I agree with you guys.
I'm so happy to hear you say that.
So I'd like to say thank you to both you, Evan and Joy, for doing this. You were fabulous. You were entertaining. There's a question and answer session at the end of this with us that we'll do. And I appreciate this because often people have never heard of this. They've heard of one walk or 2 walks maybe. And so thank you for doing this. You'll make people aware, and maybe in France they won't have to fill out those surveys, and we'll actually get more walkers who want the solitude and contemplation.
Thank you.
Jim, thank you very much for your time, and also Dennis for setting this up. You guys do a great service to us.
Well, thank you very, very much, and we look forward to seeing you in person. Thank you in person.
All right.
Okay.
Bon Camino.
Bye.
Buen Camino.
Buen Camino.